Buona tarda a
Good
tutti,
afternoon
buenas
to one and all.
tardes. Hoy
Today,
vamos a hacer
we're
este
going
webinar
to
en
organize
castellano para
this
igual
webinar in
personas que nos
Spanish because we
acompañan de
have
diferentes
several
puntos de
people
España.
following it from different
Deciros
parts
también
of
que
Spain.
contamos
We
con un
also
traductor
have
simultáneo al
simultaneous
inglés.
interpretation
So if
into
you prefer
English.
the English version, please click on the icon below, the little planet. Thank you. Así que bienvenidos y bienvenidas a esta
So,
conferencia
welcome to this 30-second webinar within the EAT Live project. On the Zoom project, you will find the link to the rest of the conferences so that you can see them again.
Como os havia comentado, este proyecto It
As you
Live
know, EAT
faz
Live is
parte del
part of
programa
the
LIFE
LIFE
de la Unión
EU
Europea
program
e
that
busca
has as a
contribuir a
goal
conseguir
to
os objetivos
meet the
Europeu
goals
e
of the
especialmente
European
os
Green
objetivos
Pact,
pela
particularly
estratégia
the
pela
Farm
granja à
to
mesa. E estes objetivos seriam
Fork
principalmente
strategy.
el de
The
reducir
idea is
la
to
huella de carbono
reduce the
associada à produção de
CO2
alimentos,
emissions from
asegurar a
food production
disponibilidade
and to
de alimentos para todas
ensure
as pessoas
food
e, em síntese,
safety and food
garantizar um cartel
accessibility with a
alimentário
fairer
mais
food
justo,
system
mais
that is also
saudável e
healthier
mais
and more
sustentable.
sustainable.
Pois bem,
Taking
tendo em
into
conta que
account
próximo
that next
sábado,
Saturday, May
20 de
the
maio,
20th,
é o Dia
is
Mundial pelas
the
Abejas,
World's
parecia
Day of Bees,
pertinente
we thought it was
dedicar
appropriate to
webinar
organize
a
a
estes
webinar
insectos que hacen
on
uma labor
these insects, focused on
absolutamente
these insects that are
fundamental para a
essential for
conservação
the
do
planet's
planeta
biodiversity through
e que
pollination.
também
And
é uma
this
labor
is key
essencial para a
also
nossa
for our
saúde. Se
health
calcula que
because
três de cada
3 out of
quatro
4
cultivos de
fruit
frutas ou
or
semillas que se
seed
produzem para
crops for
consumo
human
humano depende,
consumption
ao menos em
depend
parte,
at least
destas
partly
abejas e de
on bees
outros
and other
insectos. Pero
pollinators. However,
lamentablemente estes estão
unfortunately,
cada vez
they
mais
are becoming
amenazados por las
increasingly endangered
actividades
due to human
Así que
activities.
hoy
That's why we
invitamos a
have
Ignacio
invited today
Bartomeus, que es doctor
Ignacy
en
Bartomeus,
ecología
who's
e
a
investigador
doctor
en la
in
Estación
the
Biológica de
environment in the
Doñana y
Doñana
que hoy nos hablará sobre las
environmental
diferentes
station,
especies
and
que hay de
he will
abejas,
be
las
telling us
principales
about the
amenazas
main
para su
bee
sobrevivencia y
species
también
and
qué
what we
acciones
can
podemos hacer
do
nosotros
to
y
help
nosotras para ayudar a
preserve bees.
preservarlas. Así que
Welcome,
bienvenido
Ignacy,
Ignacio
and thank you
Benjamut y
very much
muchísimas
for
gracias
being
por
here
acompañarnos
with
hoy
us
aquí
today
desde
from
Sevilla.
Seville.
La
This
verdad
is
que es
a
un tema
topic we're
que nos
very
interesa
much
especialmente en
interested
Fundesplai.
in
Llevamos
at
bastante tiempo
Fundesplai.
trabajando
We have
para
been working
concienciar a las
for a
personas
long
sobre los
time on
grandes
raising
retos
awareness
del
about
sistema
the
alimentario global
challenges
y el
of
actual
the
contexto
world food system in a
de emergencia
context
climática,
of
¿no? Y para esto
climate
hemos
emergency.
llevado a
And
cabo
we
diversos
organize
proyectos y
different
acciones
types of
educativas
projects,
en
education
escuelas y
projects at
centros de educación
schools, and
formales y
we
para
also
conferencias
organize
presenciales y en línea,
face-to-face
como la que
conferences
estamos
and
haciendo
online
hoy,
conferences,
y
such as this one
también
today.
a través
And
de la
we
exposición
also
Nature
have an
Compacta, que
exhibition
puedes
at
visitar en
our
nuestra sede
headquarters in
en el
the
Prat de
Prat de
Llobregat en
Llobregat
Barcelona. Y
that
para que os
is a
animéis,
focus
os
on the
pasaremos un
food
pequeño
system. And I will
vídeo
just show you now a 1-minute video
adelanto de lo que
so that you can see
encontraréis en la
this
exposición.
exhibition briefly.
Muy
I'd
bien,
just
solo
like
un par de
to
apuntes más
mention a
antes de
few things
pasar
before
la
giving the
palabra a
floor to
Ignacio.
Ignacy. I'd just like to remind
Hacer
you that you can
preguntas en
ask
cualquier momento
questions during
de la
the
conferencia
webinar
utilizando
using the
la pestaña
Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and Ignacio will be answering the questions at the end of his presentation. And I'd also like you please to fill in the assessment survey that will be open in your browser once the conference ends. Now, without further ado, you have the floor, Ignacio.
Muchas gracias. Perdón.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure to be here today. The idea of my presentation is to explain what's going on with bees today. This is a quite hot topic, but it's not clear to us what's wrong with bees and what's going on with them. And to start, I'd like you to imagine a flower. So just imagine your favorite flower or flower you have at home, in your garden or in your balcony. And I'm sure you will have chosen many different flowers. Someone will have thought of a rose, someone will have thought of daisies, or maybe weeds even. And it's clear that there is a wide range of flowers. And now I'd like you to think of a bee, because, well, I'd like you to think of a bee you've seen lately. And I think that most of you will have thought of a honeybee. And the honeybee is the one we see in cartoons, the one we are most familiar with since our childhood. And that's logical, because honeybees produce something very sweet that we like, that's honey. We also associate honeybees with stings because they defend their honey. Sometimes you may bump into them, but honeybees are a small sort of bees within the world of bees, because the world of bees is as large as the world of flowers. In fact, there are over 20,000 species of bees in the world. And in Spain, where we have a large bee biodiversity, we have over 1,000 species, bee species. That's double the number of species that you get in birds. So double the number of bird species, and you get all types of bees, different colors, different behaviors. Some are parasites. And this diversity, this biodiversity is what we study. I'm sure you'll be thinking there are many different types of bees, but what are bees? Well, they're insects with 6 legs. They belong to the Hymenoptera family, the same as wasps and ants. But there's a big difference between bees and wasps, because bees are vegetarian. They just eat pollen and nectar, whereas wasps are carnivorous and they eat other insects. Bees are also hairier than wasps. It's very important for pollination that they have hairy bodies, and because being hairy helps them transport the pollen from flower to flower. And there's this species that's called Colletes that you see on the screen. Another important aspect is that not all bees live in colonies. They don't all have a queen and workers. They have a very complex social, honeybees have a very complex social structure, whereas most bees are solitary. And usually when they're adults, in spring, when they fly among flowers, what the females do is to collect nectar and pollen to make little balls of nectar and pollen that they will store in a nest. And instead of having big quantities of honey, they just make these little balls that they are going to seal in the earth. And most insects don't protect this well their larvae. And at the end of spring, the larva will leave the nest and they will feed off that pollen, and they'll spend the whole winter hibernating in these nests. And it won't be until the following spring, with the rain and the higher temperatures, they will leave the nest and they will start mating. They only mate once in a lifetime. And that's how the cycle starts again. The females will start preparing the nest. As I mentioned before, bees are very diverse. They're quite spectacular and they're very important because they provide an ecosystemic service. They play a very important role in the ecosystem. But first of all, they are key for the reproduction of plants. They transport pollen from plant to plant together with other pollinators such as butterflies. But bees, in fact, are the most specialized pollinators. This is a chart where we see the pollinator richness, and the more species you have, the better the fruit set. And this is very important because not all bees visit all flowers. Imagine those toys for children where you have circles and squares and you have to fit in the right piece in the right hole. And the same happens with bees. They need to have this complementarity to be able to pollinize all flowers. You cannot have one single type of a bee pollinizing all flowers. You have big bees for big flowers and so on. That's why it's so important to have this diversity of bees. And the role of pollinization is paramount. But all species are important because they are the result of millions of years of evolution. They are a wonder of nature. And I believe that we have the obligation of preserving all species. And also, it's important to think that bees are essential for many of the crops we eat. As Barbara mentioned, 75% of crops do depend on pollinizers to improve their pollination, and fruits that have vitamins depend more on pollinizers. And that's why there is this alarm about the reduction of pollinators. We've heard about the pollinator crisis and the pollinator decline, and very often it's not clear where the figures come from. We have been studying the trends, and I'm going to discuss some with you. First of all, we need to look at what's happening in recent years. Now, the population on the planet is over 8,000 million people. And it's not just that we're a lot of people, it's what we do, our industrial activities. And with extreme temperatures, we are now living a scenario of climate change that is impacting the insect population. And we're particularly good at transforming very diverse area into very simple areas. We change the uses of land and we transform land from complex and diverse areas to very simplistic crops. And this is having an impact on bees. And when we refer to trends, it's important to look at the honeybee trends, but their situation is not the most alarming situation. We have farmers with beehives, and here we have this chart for Europe. There are many honeybee colonies, many beehives in Europe, and they have been increasing up to 20% in the last few years. I'm not saying that honeybees are not having any trouble, because the mortality and their diseases are higher and more serious than in the past. However, we do have farmers that do take care of honeybees. And although we have to take good care of honeybees, populations are not endangered. In fact, they're growing, as I mentioned before. So when we're talking about preserving bees, we shouldn't be focusing on honeybees. For example, I'll give you a comparison. Imagine we want to preserve the biodiversity of birds, and for that we just start creating more chicken farms, but that's not going to help with the wild bird biodiversity. So what's happening with the rest of bees, the other thousands of species? Well, once you start studying honeybees, they are easier because they're in beehives. However, other types of bees are difficult to study because their adult life is short, it's 2, 3, 4 weeks per year. They're small and they're very quick. And 100 years ago, there were few studies on bees, so it's difficult to study them, but we do have some trends. However, the red list of bees was published in 2014, and it shows which species are extinct, which ones are in danger of extinction. And the most important data is that over 50% of species in Europe cannot be studied properly. We don't know whether they are all right or not, and that is alarming because it's very likely that many of them are endangered and we don't know. However, it's also true that due to this alarm, there is more research being done. I'd like to give you an example that we have developed in Valladolid together with Oscar Aguado. This is one of the few places in Spain where there are old census of the 70s and 80s, because there was an entomologist who did some census with very good methods, so we can look back at that data and check it against today's data. And here in this chart, we compare the two sample times, and the number of species has decreased significantly, almost 40%. However, if we pay attention to the details, there's something very interesting. These 3 points in black, yellow, and blue, these areas were agricultural areas and near the cities. But the good news is that there are 2 places in red and in green where we have virtually recovered all the species that existed originally. These are bush areas, rural areas that have been abandoned. And this means that the glass is half full. So it's true that we're losing biodiversity in some areas, but there are other areas where we can recover the populations, the bee populations. I'd like to mention some of the main causes of the current situation, this global change that is impacting bees and their populations. First of all, we see a loss of habitat. I would say this is the key factor, because if you have bushes and forests and plains with all the necessary plants for these bees, with a complex diversity, and then we simplify this diversity, this biodiversity, then the bees won't have the old trunks and trees and the land necessary for their nest, because many bee species need to feed from specific flowers. They're not going to feed from your rose bush or your lavender bush in your garden. They need specific plants to feed from. So that is a filter for some species. Those bee species that are more specialized, that are more sensitive, cannot overcome those changes. However, many bee species are quite flexible and know how to adapt. And in large cities such as Barcelona or Seville, there is a large range of bees with about 30 or 40 different species that have adapted to the urban spaces. However, if they have this first disruption of simplifying the plant diversity, and then we expose them to pesticides or herbicides to kill weeds, then we're putting even more pressure on bees. The second or third important factor would be climate change. I'm sure you have seen other charts like this one, where the increase of temperatures and average CO2 is growing significantly with record values. And when there's an increase of temperatures, particularly when there's a drought, that this has a huge impact on insects, particularly on insects that are ectothermic, that cannot regulate their own body temperature. The outside temperature impacts the body, and therefore the impact of high temperature is higher on them, because in humans we can self-regulate our temperature, and we also have the possibility of using air conditioning or a coat when there's a change of temperature. There's a beautiful example in the north of Spain of historical records of the bumblebee populations. Bumblebees are very easy to recognize because they're very big and hairy. And not all bumblebee species live everywhere because they have evolved and adapted to different heights. Those that live in the plains have other resources, and they develop with other humidity and heat conditions. So there's a variety of niches. What's happened with the temperature increase? Well, the bumblebees have been flying higher up to look for their right temperature and humidity. So there has been this change of bumblebees moving outwards, and it's a problem because those that were at the plains have been able to climb up the mountain, but not the ones that were already at the mountain tops because they have nowhere higher to climb. And the higher up you go, the mountain, the less land there is. So species that had more land favorable or adapted to their needs are now in areas with less land. And the climate change is so quick that it's difficult for these species to adapt. And the loss of habitat is one of the greatest dangers, but the climate change is becoming increasingly more and more important. And one last factor I like to mention is the species movement, particularly when there are pathogens, pathogenic, I meant. And after the pandemic, we're all aware of the dangers of having pathogens that can mutate, and this can have an impact, for example, on some bees, and there are different pathogens that are not native from Spain and that are endangering the honeybees here in Spain. So they are not used to this type of parasite. And this is something we can work on to make sure that we don't transport biologic merchandise throughout the world in an uncontrolled way. Well, this is the first part of my presentation. It's more depressing in the sense that we see what the current situation is. However, I'd like to say on a more positive note that pollinators can be very important for the preservation of biodiversity. And we know that large mammals are now being preserved. And now with bees, we have a clear alarm. We know that the populations have been reduced. However, their extinction in Europe and in Spain hasn't been properly documented. The extinction of bee species. Most species do still have viable, feasible populations. And that's good because that means that if we just change some of the factors that are threatening them, then we can recover these populations. Because if they do become extinct in 30 or 40 years, then that's irreversible. So now is the time to act, and we can do something now. This is a huge opportunity to show how these preservation activities can have a positive impact. And preserving bees is easier than preserving the lynx that needs large areas, well-preserved areas to have viable, feasible populations. And in the case of bees, they have very small foraging ranges. you have the peak of activity that is just 700 meters or 1 kilometer. That's the range. They move around their nests. Most bee species are very, very local in the sense of their foraging range. Some larger species do have a larger foraging range of up to 2 kilometers, but we don't need to make huge efforts for the preservation as we would need for other endangered species. At our research group, we wanted to develop a more applied type of preservation. That's why we created the Wild Bee Association. And if you're interested in bees, you can have a look at our website because we have created some guidelines to identify the bees, the different types of bees, because it's very difficult to preserve something that you don't know, that you're not fascinated with. So first of all, we need to be aware of this biodiversity. And we've also conducted some restoration projects in, this is the Habitat project, where we work together with farmers to explain the problem and what can be done. The idea is to recover the boundaries between the crops that used to be wider in the past and had a lot of plants. However, with the mechanization, with tractors and with pesticides, they have been lost in many cases. And this means losing pollination and the regulation of many of the pests that we have. Here, for example, we recovered these boundaries between plots where we would plant local species, Mediterranean plant species, and thinking also about bushes that can capture carbon. This was a beautiful project. And we recovered in Catalonia over 100 boundaries. And the potential of each of these boundaries to maintain, to preserve healthy populations is really high. And as we know, the most important effect is in the intermediate parts, to be able to do something in areas that are very destroyed with a very high simplification of the territory. Just a small action is difficult to attract species. However, in intermediate areas where there are some trees and some streams, that's where we see that these actions are particularly efficient. One thing that we found surprising after talking to hundreds of farmers, we asked them about the barriers for implementing these actions. And I thought they would say that these actions are incompatible with pesticides, or that it's too expensive, or they don't have the time to do it. However, and of course, these are barriers, but the main one is the lack of information. And this is good news because we have the information. We just have to communicate this information, and we have created some materials, some documents with very practical advice so that we can have crops that are compatible with pollination. so that we can ensure a sustainable food system. And after explaining all these threats, all these negative things, I'd like to highlight the Showcase European project that is being conducted in the whole of Europe. The European Union is making huge efforts to include the preservation of pollinators within the agricultural policies. It's a slow process, but at least it's on the agenda of many institutions and political groups, and that is good news. Here you can see two photos where you just see one single tree among these crops, where it's much more difficult to recover the bee populations. However, it's easier in the landscape on the bottom photograph, where you see a variety of trees and plants. And this is what we have found out in our research. The more variety of crops we have, the better it is to attract pollinators, and those crops are also more productive. However, the cost of having several crops in small plots are much higher than just having large crops in one single crop. I mean, one in large land. So we have to think about the landscape. We want to prioritize the more biodiverse landscape with all its positive implications, or whether we want to focus on the short-term financial return of just a few people, usually, because it's not usually well distributed when you find these single crop lands. We already have examples where in the common agricultural policy, we see these boundaries with flowers, green covers. And if you have any farmers today in this webinar, I'm sure you'll be thinking that it's difficult to receive the subsidies and aids from the EU, and it's true, but we want to show the EU how this can be an efficient type of project that is not difficult and can be very beneficial for small farmers. And I'm feeling optimistic because, as I said, this type of project is already on the agenda of the EU, and it can have a huge positive impact on biodiversity. And lastly, I wanted to explain things that one can do at home, because as citizens, we feel with a responsibility that is not fully ours, and that can be quite stressful because we don't really have that much margin to do things. But it's important to join other people, to create associations, to vote well. To vote well means to vote clear actions, political actions. But apart from this, at our association, we have launched a project this spring, and it's called Zumbidos. And very often it's something very simple that you can just do in a balcony or in a small piece of land. And these actions are useful because very often we find that there is a lack of information, and people do want to do things, but they don't know what to do, or what they do is not appropriate. Therefore, I will send you a very short survey through the chat to see which are the barriers for preservation. It's just 5 minutes, a 5-minute survey, and it does help us to understand your motivations, and then we can send you a link to the 9 simple actions you can carry out, and they are available on the website as well. Let me summarize one of these actions, and it's called put away those scissors. Because sometimes one of the best things we can do is do nothing. And this is difficult to explain to city councils or institutions that want to help pollinators. But sometimes just to delay the grass cutting, or not to cut some grass, or not to remove dead trees, you can just leave them there. It's very important also to have heterogeneous areas so different species can build their nests there. And it's important to have a wilder type of garden. You don't need to have everything nicely cropped. It's good to have wilder boundaries with lavender, for example, that can help with pollinators. And if you'd like to know more, we have more information on our website. So in short, these were the main messages I wanted to share with you today. The main key message is enjoy bees, enjoy observing bees. They're easy to see in the gardens, in the countryside. Let yourself be fascinated by bees. And I like to say that we're not going to lose all the bees, but the most vulnerable bees will disappear if we don't do anything. And I do think that it's important to be realistic. And if we take better care of bees and we maintain their habitat, and we create spaces where we can coexist with them, then we can overcome the current population decline and have a bigger population, a bigger bee population in every area. Well, that's all. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ignacio. It's been wonderful because there have been many questions on the chat that you have been answering while you were talking. For example, these strategies that you mentioned, such as putting away your scissors, are very much aligned with some of the questions on the chat. Can people living in the cities do something to preserve bees? What can we do at home in our balconies? What can we do as citizens? But you have already answered these questions, and we can find this information on your website. But maybe you have some extra recommendations for people living in the city? Well, I just wanted to state that it's important to create habitats in the city. And it's also good for children to be able to be fascinated by nature. But the species that live in the city are the most resistant ones, and they are capable of overcoming the current stress. However, it's the most vulnerable species that don't reach the cities. So that's really good that you try and improve the urban habitat for bees, but there are other bees that are more sensitive. Okay, and what would be the role of urban parks, city parks? Could they be helping in any way? Yes, of course, of course. Particularly in cities that are growing and growing, and where we have urban parks that are becoming more naturalized, and to be able to preserve natural areas and to include them in the city and to protect them. And an action that is really simple and that we already saw during the lockdown. If you stop cutting the grass every 2 weeks and you stop using pesticides, it's amazing how flowers grow. And there have been many initiatives in some universities, in some campuses, and in other institutions where they're trying to have a wilder land. Of course, and it's very important as well to raise awareness because, for example, there's a question about whether you have been discussing the importance of bees with science programs. Well, we are learning to disseminate the message because as scientists, you're not taught to communicate and disseminate messages. And of course, there is the limitation of budgets, and there's usually not much of a budget for communication purposes. But it's true that it's important to cooperate with experts in communication and to have multidisciplinary teams. Yes, this would be very important. Now, as far as threats go, you have mentioned the three main threats: the climate change, the loss of habitat, the movement of species. However, we have a question here from Marta, who says, to what extent electromagnetic radiations, for example, those of mobile phones, can stress and make difficult pollination? This is something that was mentioned some time ago. There was an alarm around this topic, but there is no evidence that this electromagnetic radiation has an impact, a strong impact on these insects. I think that the effect of this radiations is negligible compared to the other causes. So we shouldn't be too concerned about this. I read recently an article on radiation. Okay, now there is another question. As consumers, can we know whether the food that we buy are really from crops that are bee friendly? Well, that's a difficult question because the most typical certification is that of organic agriculture. That means that there are no pesticides used, and therefore they are more bee-friendly. However, as far as I know, there's no specific certificate that states that there are biodiversity-friendly crops. And there are many traditional crops that are very respectful with nature because they're small plots of land with a diversity of crops, and pesticides are only used when there is a clear sign of a pest, and they can be better than other areas that have organic crops where the land or the crops are very large and the land is very clean. Of course, organic crops are more respectful or more environmentally friendly, but one has to take into account all these other things as well. It's important to know also about the plastic used for the packaging, how far away a product comes from, and it's difficult as consumers to know all this. Yes, and this is very much associated with this other question about the vegetable species that would be better to recover the most threatened wild bees. Diversity is key. And if you have a land with a small vegetable garden and almond trees and sunflowers, this type of diversity is going to be much more beneficial for bees than if you just have a crop of one type of tree or one type of fruit or whatever. And fruit trees are very important for bees because they have these flowers with nectar at the beginning of the season. Any crops with flowers will be used by pollinators, such as sunflowers. And Nuria is asking whether there are any plant species that are more favorable for bees, for example, garden plants that are not local plants. Are they good for bees? Well, the bees that have evolved in the Iberian Peninsula have adapted to the plants of the Iberian Peninsula. So many exotic species have more complex flowers, and the colors and even the pollen or nectar composition is not the type that the local bees, the indigenous bees, look for. So the more local the species are, the better. But biodiversity is key, because if I just say that rosemary and lavender are attractive, then everybody is just going to end up having rosemary and lavender. We need biodiversity, local biodiversity, with varieties that are as wild as possible, because within rosemary and lavender, there can be some garden species that look better. However, their genetics has been greatly modified and the flowers are not so accessible to pollinators. And we have another question about insect hotels. There are many schools that are working with children with insect hotels. Do they help wild bees? Well, yes, it's a wonderful tool so that children and the population in general get to know the world of bees. Nevertheless, the very large hotels do have some additional problems. Because if you have a large number of bee species, then you're attracting parasites and some pathogens. And if they are not cleaned properly, then they end up not being so wonderful. So it's perfect if they are in botanic gardens or other areas where they're well taken care of. And in terms of preservation, they are not harmful, but you're just benefiting a small number of species that are quite common species. And it would be better, as I mentioned before, to create other types of habitat, because sometimes you find some very resistant species in the cities that will just nest anywhere.
No, por un momento te perdí, Nacho, pero ya, sí. Pues no, ya acabamos aquí. Volvemos al tema de Internet. Bueno, antes habíamos hablado
we mentioned before mobile phones and electromagnetic radiations. And what happens with the 5G antennas in rural areas? Is that a threat for bees? Apart from destroying the habitat to build these antennas, one shouldn't really be concerned about them. The problem is the impact of installing them in an area that didn't have this kind of infrastructure before. Now, we have another question about whether it's possible to have more information about the projects you mentioned. Is there a link you can share with us, a website where we can get more information? Yes. If you log in alvejasilvestres.com, and we're also on Twitter and Instagram, all the resources I mentioned are available there. So it's abejasilvestres.es, not com, es, okay, .es. Well, that's all. Thank you very much, Ignacy. It's been a really interesting presentation. We've had many questions, and I would like to thank everybody that's been participating from different points in Spain. Thank you very much, and I will see you on our next webinar. Thank you. Goodbye.